I will introduce the panel, of which I believe I am missing one. So I guess we'll go. First is Yvette Branson. She is the director of the Vital Initiative with the VA, and I think you're going to speak to that question that was spoken to previously about the VA. Sitting to her right is Daniel Mistak. 18 months ago, Daniel, who's a PhD student at the University of Berkeley and also a law graduate, showed up in our office as a volunteer, saying that he wanted to write his dissertation on what the Affordable Care Act meant for the criminal justice system. I said it wasn't ripe yet. Dan started working, and now he can tell you about the work that he's doing. And sitting next to him is Tina Masci. Masci, sorry, Tina Masci, who is a professor at the Fordham Graduate School of Social Services. So with that, I guess we're starting with you.
So I think the question was how are these issues also paralleled in the community of veterans who are returning from the recent conflicts? Is that more or less? Yeah. Okay. So I'm honored to be here. It's not the community I'm usually in. I'm usually dealing with people at the VA and mental health folks and people who work with veterans. So this is a whole different world for me, and it's great to be here because I'm learning a lot. So I'm a little nervous because I may not get the right lingo or know exactly how to frame this, but from my perspective, working with that population is similar to those who are decarcerated. And this idea of how do we absorb people back into the community, and what kinds of structures do we need to have in place for them so that they feel supported and they can successfully reintegrate. And one thing that the VA has done that's right is pilot this project, which is the Vital Initiative, because the people who, and I'm just going to speak from my perspective in the population that I know, we're all sitting there at the hospital waiting for these veterans to come to us because they have these benefits and entitlements, and we know that we can offer them some help, and they're not showing up, they're not coming to us. So the VA decided to send us out to them. So a few of us are doing this kind of work out in the community, and my placement is on college campuses because that's where the veterans are. And it's been wonderful, and John Jay was my first school that I've connected to because there are something like 600 to 800 veterans, student veterans here, and they're transitioning here on campus. So we'll have some veterans who'll say, I was in Iraq 2 weeks ago, and I'm really glad because I got back in time for spring semester, and I'm thinking, oh my, they're gonna be transitioning in the classroom. Do the professors know who these people are that are sitting there trying to focus on the material in the classroom? And what can I do to support them so that they succeed, so we get them to graduation? So, it is very, very, very similar. Any other part of that you want me to talk about more?
I think you'll get questions as we go forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, and I want to thank everybody also for allowing me to be here. I really appreciate it, and I want to say this isn't my work that I'm doing. All I'm doing is writing about what Alameda County is doing. They're operating on 3 principles that I think might be provocative or interesting to you. The first of those principles is mass incarceration is a myth. The second principle is that reintegration is a myth. And the third principle is that the jail exists somehow outside of this community. And what I mean by that is mass incarceration is a myth because it doesn't affect each of us directly. There is not a chance that I'm going to walk outside of this building and be stopped and frisked by a New York City Police Department officer. That's just the way it is. The incarceration that we see now targets a particular population. And as Mr. Rosenberg said, we can't not talk about race. We can't not talk about socioeconomic class and how this ties in with that situation as well. And at the jail, they recognize this. In the sheriff's office, they recognize this. I was walking through the jail with a lieutenant there, and what he said to me is, before I became a lieutenant, I was a sports writer for just for the local communities around town. And there was a star football player who was at the top of his game. He could have gone to any college that he wanted to. And then one day, he just disappeared. And then I got my new job at the sheriff's office, and I worked my way through the sheriff's system, and suddenly I see that kid. And then he says to me, he goes, you know what, if you or I made the same mistake, whatever the mistake that kid was, we wouldn't be here in this same situation. Now this is the lieutenant, and this is something that's coming from inside of the jail. This is somebody whose vision is going to be shaping the way Alameda County views its relationship towards the people that it polices. And I think that's a powerful statement and a really important change in the way the discourse happens there. Now the second thing is reentry is a myth. So Alameda County Sheriff's Office is in charge of policing the non-integrated portions of Alameda County. In these areas, there is no integration that exists before the jail. After the jail, they go back into the same socioeconomic situation that existed before. They go back into the same communities that had the same sorts of brokenness that existed before. There is nothing to reintegrate into. And so what they're trying to do at the Alameda County Sheriff's Office is really trying to stimulate ways in which they can have an integrated community beforehand. So what they're doing is they've created the Youth and Family Service Bureau, which offers free counseling to anybody whose life is touched by the carceral system. So if you have a parent who's been in jail, if you've been in jail, you can have a clinical case manager who's going to be with you, who's going to talk to you through the process. They'll connect you to CalFresh, which is the food stamps in California. They'll connect you with social services. They want to make sure that they can plug you into anything that exists along the way. But before that even happens, they want to make sure that there is an integrated system before all of this happens to begin with. So one of the other things that they're doing is they created a soccer league. It just started out with about 15 kids who were coming together to play. Now it's over 150 adults and 1,500 kids who are coming. And what Lieutenant Nideffer said to me, he said, what we're doing here is we're creating communities. We're creating people who are invested in one another so that these people then can go on to be the governors. These are the people who care enough to make decisions about what their community needs. And I think that's a really powerful statement. Often, I think it's really easy to fall into the idea that we have a governance structure, and then at the very bottom what we have is the people that we're policing and the community that we're policing. What we really need to do is we need to understand that these communities need to be able to have the agency to guide themselves, and sometimes our governance structures gets in the way of that process. So that's one of the most inspiring things that I've seen at the ACSO. They want to lead people so that they can get out of the way. They don't want to keep on guiding people the whole way through. And the third thing is about the fact that Santa Rita Jail understands that it is not something that exists outside of this community structure and this system. It is already integrated into the fabric of that world. The police are there. The police want to be able to play a different kind of policing role inside of the community. And the way that they're doing this is that they've got grants in order to create what's called the Reach Ashland Youth Center. So Ashland is one of those unincorporated cities in Alameda County. And so what happens in this situation now is they have all of these children and youth who are able to come to this youth center. They host poetry slams, they have video game nights, they have it's a beautiful center, and all of this is staffed by deputies. These are the people who they see walking down the street. You know, I think it's really unbelievably sad that people don't know who's on the beat anymore. I mean, that's a major problem. And Alameda County recognizes that. So what they're trying to do is they want to get their deputies out there. They want the deputies to be involved with these kids from the beginning so that when something happens, when a legitimate crime is going on, the people trust the deputies enough to say, all right, this is something, these are the people that we can trust in order to help us. And one of the things that Lieutenant Nideffer and some of these great folks at Alameda County wanted me to bring to you is to say one of the ways that they're trying to do reintegration the best is by not ever having kids enter the system. And the way that they started doing this was by using money that's available through Medicaid in order to get juveniles into different kinds of services for behavioral health so that the kid's first interaction with a deputy or somebody who's in Alameda County Sheriff's Office is a positive one, with a positive outcome, one that actually gives them more power, one that doesn't take away power from them. And I think that that's something that might be missing with the way that we view how policing is supposed to work. Is there anybody from corrections here today? I'm very interested in that question. Now, we've got two folks here from corrections. I think that they're excluded from the conversation too much. The way that we have this conversation is we either act in the academy as though it's still the 1970s, and if anybody's familiar with Berkeley history, It's kind of amazing that I even have access there, because the Alameda County was known as the Blue Meanies, who were coming in to stomp down any free speech movement. There's interest and there's drive inside of these policing bodies, but the problem is there are a lot of bureaucratic and structural factors that keep police locked into a particular kind of role. And we have to be able to reimagine and allow the policing systems to reimagine how they're going to be able to really meet the needs of the communities that they serve. So, thank you.
So Dan, before I go to Tina, could you talk a little bit about the county's efforts to enroll folks coming out of Santa Rita and how that fits into their community policing model?
Right. So this is the problem. So I've mentioned this obliquely, but since the new sheriff's taken over, they really want to adopt a new community policing model, which, like I said, the police are no longer they don't want the police to be viewed as the bad guys. The problem is that that's easy enough when somebody's out on the street. So you see a big mix of people all the time. Sometimes you're helping a kid, sometimes you're stopping a crime, but there's enough community involvement to realize that there are people with diverse interests and that this is a community that you are a part of. Now, what happens on the inside of the jail is you only end up seeing, if you're a booking agent, you only end up seeing the people who are coming in drunk or decompensating, or have just committed a crime. You kind of start losing that community policing mentality. So one of the things that Lieutenant Nideffer and Sheriff Ahern, what they want to do is they want to start enrolling people for the ACA who are coming through the jail. And what this process does is then it reminds the booking agents at that process to say, these people have nothing. They have been systematically excluded from entitlements. And what we can do here is that we can provide these people with something as they're coming through. We can send them out maybe in a little bit of a better position than they came in, and remind the booking agents themselves that they're a part of this community too, and that they have to be invested in the outcomes for this community.
Oh, great. Tina?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today to talk about aging people in prison. That's where I've done a lot of my work, although I did work in corrections for over 15 years with both juveniles, adults, and older people in prisons, including specialized mental health care units. And I did so as a licensed clinical social worker, which I think adds a perspective to the dialogue, in that the role that a social worker often plays within a correctional facility, whether in the community or not, is almost a mediator between working with issues to do with corrections and public safety, but also being of service to the clientele, which would be incarcerated people or formerly incarcerated people. And as we're talking about deinstitutionalization today, I'm sorry, Ernie, I wasn't here at the beginning, I was teaching class, but I'm not quite sure if it was mentioned that prior to the establishment of asylums we found many mentally ill people in prisons. And that was where Dorothea Dix, who was one of the foremothers of social work and probably public health as well, of which he really went around and rallied to get people out of correctional systems, of which asylums were created, of which we deinstitutionalized. So as I'm thinking about this today, I almost think of the theme of Groundhog Day. How many times do we have to do this? And before we realize that maybe it's not the buildings, these might be structures, but perhaps there's some social structure here when it gets really into multiple stigmatizations against, as Dr. Lorano says, persons with mental illness, disenfranchised youth, as persons with disabilities, aging people. When you put all the stigmatized populations together, what we're seeing is the mass incarceration of the elderly. And in a project that I did originally, looking specifically at cumulative trauma, coping, and well-being among older adults in prison, I had worked in corrections for all that time, and I still find out more that I'm amazed about. And the fact that this idea of continuing to disenfranchise and have aggravated disadvantages across the life course, this continues to the end. And as a community, we are watching it or we're oblivious to it, and once we know about it, I mean, how many more images do we need to see about older people in prison? And perhaps the most stunning of them all, if you're awake to it, is when we hear the stories of people dying in prison that are chained to beds because of the nature of their offense. So most of the older people that we have in prison are those with violent and sex offenses. So we need to think about the kinds of decision-making when it comes to thinking about decarceration, because we have a whole lot of people who are older in prisons. In New York, we have 9,000 over the age of 50. And if you're quite surprised why I'm saying age 50 is old, there's a process of accelerated aging that they're finding among people in prison. So there's many barriers to people who are older in prison. And part of it is getting out, especially if they got incarcerated during the stricter sentencing policies of the 1980s. So we are seeing the rise as a part of a human-made disaster. And so if we're going to do this again, how are we going to do it right? And we were talking about demonization of people, so we need to think about, as I've learned from working with older people in prison, is that we need to think of the positive. Okay, and so if we are talking about not demonizing, what are we saying we want to do or we need to do? So I would suggest it's a divination of this group of people, or everyone in general, but because we are all human beings. That's the most important thing. And I have found that the stories of older people in prison, and despite every disadvantage based on race, gender, age, you can put at them, they still are here, and they are resilient, and they are here to tell their stories, or at least I might be able to share on their behalf, that they have hope for us, that we will wake up to the situation that is going on with what mass incarceration or mass stigmatization of so many groups that we don't want to look at, all stockpiled in prisons. And so some of the barriers that I hear from both the older people in prison, post-reentry, as well as service providers, is, first of all, there's a psychological and emotional experience to reentry. We need to take that into, it's not just this literal thing, but in terms of being psychologically prepared, those that are getting out are thinking about that transition. They have an emotional reaction to that experience, and depending on how that goes, and or if their service is in prison, they're better able to transition to the community. The other aspect of it is that if they have experience in terms of employment and other programming that they can have access to in prison, that makes a difference. Many people older people in prison, they have a diversity of skills, and again, it depends on how long they're in prison. That makes a difference in their transition to the community. Those with longer term sentences have a more difficult, they often call it a type of prisonization, where they have to adjust to getting to the community, as opposed to someone with a shorter term, the longer you're away from the community. And I do agree with this, with the idea of that prisons are part of our community, and so it is a social structure. We're creating these barriers and silos where they don't exist. Prisons are our community, and they're part of it. We created them, and it's just a building. It's what we make of it. It's like a Rorschach test, and if we separate it and silo it as if it is not, it is our community. And so we have to think and begin to connect, just like I found with older people telling me, where they get a sense of spirituality and interconnectedness. We don't have that on the outside. We don't have agencies talking to one another. We just certain professions, we look at parts or agencies. We're looking at physical health, mental health, social care, and nobody's talking to each other and putting together the whole human being. And if anything, older people in prison are a symbol of our time at the end of the day. If we're all born, we're all die, alpha, omega. This is a critical omega point, and I would suggest as a community we look at it and be empowered. The people, many that I work with, are able to do it, and I think that we could do it too.
Thanks, Tina. And in terms of imagining new structures, we're now 3 months and 3 weeks into enactment of the Affordable Care Act, and we know of at least 2 states that are putting out RFPs to take their medically frail elderly prisoners and move them into community-based skilled nursing facilities in order to have Medicaid pick up their tab. So I think we are going to see more and more of those kinds of structures. And with that, I think we're going to have questions for our panelists. Does someone have a microphone? Who has the mic?
It's for the cameras, though.
Yeah. So if you could identify yourself and...
Thank you. So I would love to know more about the veterans parallel. We have done some funding of sort of like one-stop shop centers for veterans throughout New York State, and we have a blueprint of like the kinds of components that those centers should have and how they're useful for veterans. So I would love to think through what would that look like when we're thinking about decarcerated communities. But I also have another question for the two of you about the idea of prison and jail as part of the community. In New York, in the experience or the knowledge that I have, the limited knowledge that I have about who is in prison in New York is the folks from, the majority of the folks who are incarcerated from the 5 boroughs and the upstate. So the populations inside the prisons are not really from the nearby community. So it's a different dynamic, I think, from what I hear is going on in Alameda County, where the folks that are incarcerated are from the same community where the prison is. So
That's a jail versus prison distinction.
Yeah.
So in Alameda County, it's a jail, not a prison.
okay, so
Right.
that shows my ignorance.
Jails are run by the county, so anybody who's taken in that county gets brought to that jail and booked in that facility. So it is a completely different place with completely different means and methods for reentry. So it is a much more community-centered type of institution there. So that makes a big difference.
So I can give you a picture of what I do on the college campuses. In terms of a one-stop shop, I try to offer as many different resources to the veterans so that they know they can come to me and ask any question possible. I also don't have the word psychologist on my card. If they know that I'm a psychologist, that's fine. They call me Yvette. I don't go by doctor. I try to really destigmatize that whole thing. But should they need help, they also know they can come to me. I'm getting to know this group of people in terms of what this generation is like. I try to understand what is meaningful to them, what will make a difference in terms of what I can offer them in terms of my services, and building the community. Again, I keep hearing that word community over and over, and it's so important. I'm on campus to help the veterans find each other who may feel like they can't really show their face on campus because a couple of different things I've heard is New York is a very liberal state, and some of the professors, or look down on them. Someone will ask them something stupid in a class, like, how many people did you kill? So yes, they still do that. And so they're afraid to put forth that they're veterans because of all the things that will come at them. So a piece of my work is to do military cultural competence, and a couple of the slides are what to ask, what not to ask. You can ask what their job was in their service, but don't ask them how many people they killed, because that's going to trigger a lot of things that they don't want to be thinking about. And, you know, okay, so I'm educating these communities. So not only am I working to build the community of veterans so that they have each other's support where they have lost that belongingness from when they were in the service, to try to at least find it again to some extent. So a veterans lounge, how important is it for them to know that they can go to a place and just be with each other? And I have resistance from every private school that I work in, every private university that I work in. CUNY is doing it. Almost every CUNY school, I think, has a veterans lounge and at least is funded for a veteran coordinator. There's a fabulous coordinator here. We have a great experience working together. He's really brought the Vital Initiative full force onto the campus. So, and the third piece is that, again, veterans, they've served their country, they've gone in danger's way for us. We owe it to them to make sure they get the benefits that they deserve when they come back. If they don't know that they have free health care at VA, which many of them don't, that's a problem. So I want to make sure that I let them know all the services and benefits that are due to them, and I get them connected. So they don't even have to go to the hospital to get into the system, our system. I will do all their paperwork and then make their first appointment for them. And I will meet them at the hospital door if they feel overwhelmed just stepping in. And I haven't mentioned PTSD yet, which is pretty amazing.
So, Eva, I want to just frame that in another way. So one of the things you know about the transition clinic network that's been happening with folks coming out of prisons that are using peer counselors to help them navigate the health system when they come out. I think part of what I'm hearing you talk about is the importance of calling what I'll call peer affinity groups, because I don't want to use the youth community because we're overusing it. Okay. I think that's another parallel. I think there's a fascinating data bit from Pima County, Arizona, which is in Tucson. And so they were having a 54% no-show rate for their mentally ill folks at court date. So they were failing to appear, they were getting warrants sworn out for them, and when they got rearrested again, they wouldn't score out to be released on their own recognizance because they had FTA'd. So what Pima County did is they created a peer counseling program to ensure that the seriously mentally ill would end up in court for their court date. They went from a 54% no-show rate to a 0% no-show rate to an 8% no-show rate last year. Again, I think this speaks to the whole importance of what I'm calling peer affinity groups in this whole concept of decarceration. There were other hands up. Whoever has the mic gets to choose.
Rodriguez. I'm currently at Union Theological Seminary. I'm working as a prison chaplain. And I come from a legal career many years, many decades before that. So, Mr. Rosenberg, I want to thank you for saying we should not stay away from racism. And I want to suggest that we take a page out of what the very conservative right wing of this country does, which is they have a very solidified ideology, that's based on patriarchy, that's based on racism, based on free markets, all of which help sustain the system that we have. Capitalism creates a surplus population of people. It's part of, why we have such a large incarceration rate. Jobs were disappearing as the war on drugs was being declared. So my suggestion is the right-wing people, when they have conferences, they call everybody into the room. The media, the church, the politicians, the philosophers, the economists. They, sort of crossbreed. Their ideas are cross-referenced. People that go to NRA conferences learn about, abortion issues. We don't do that on the progressive side. So I think that you mentioned, where are the correction people here? Where are the church people here? The church has failed communities, and some of them are beginning to realize it and are beginning to work with, we had an example of a woman here at the table who is working with churches. So we will not get anywhere if we don't solidify as much as the right wing does and have a counter ideology. that is counter to, the excesses of free market, that's counter to racism, that's counter to gender inequality, that's counter to, discrimination against gays. So, I want to suggest that in the future, in holding conferences like this, that we really reach out across the disciplines. Because I just think we have to, kind of play by the same rules the right does, and they do a good job of maintaining their ideology and sustaining these structures that continue to replicate.
I appreciate that. And so in my opening remarks, part of what I tried to suggest as part of the reimagining, or what we at COCHS think are the three core principles around which we can begin that discussion, which was not ignoring the conversation about race, paying attention to the political economy that will promote decarceration, and understanding the relationship between entitlement and empowerment. And I think that it's extremely important that we define some core common threads that we can use as principles in order to build coalitions. Dan, I think you want to make a comment.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is really important too is it's not just counter ideology, but it's counter reality that I think has to be created. And this is another one of the things that I think Alameda County Sheriff's Office is trying to do, is so that they've created something called Dig Deep Farms, which is for formerly incarcerated individuals. They provide a stipend for people who come through so that they can, they allow people to access a vertically integrated urban farm. It's an 8-acre farm. They teach people how to grow food, how to accumulate the food together, and then how to be able to sell that on a market. I mean, that's a very almost right-wing type of idea of using the market, but it's used towards a completely different end. So I think that we also have to not be afraid on the progressive side to just not even want to touch different kinds of market forces or ways that markets do legitimately work out in the world, because there is that reality out there, and we have to be able to understand that market can be bent and it can be turned, and it isn't just the ideology, but there's a material reality to it as well. And that other things will follow after that. Justice can follow after we start bending these systems. So that's something, too, that Alameda County is very aware of what they're doing.
I think, Pedro, you had a question, Ernie, you had a question. There was one back there, too, yeah.
My question is for Yvette in regards to the vitals. Do you work with the families of the veterans as well?
My position at VA is primarily to work with whoever's on campus. So there are children of veterans who are using their mother or father's GI Bill on the campus. So yes, I work with them as well.
There was a comment made earlier, and a very good one, about the role of race in this whole issue. And I agree with that. I think that the plantation model is still embedded in our social economy, our government, our way of policing, our way of thinking about social issues really stem from an unsettled and unfully discoursed issues of the role of that plantation model. But I would ask the panel to think about perhaps what are some of the other issues that are rising now which have to do with class and power in American society, so that it's not only the underpinnings of racism, but it's also what is the role of affluent and well-educated non-whites in this process, and where do they come to the table? Because I think as long as we continue to have the discourse of almost whites and others, we lose sight of the fact that we share a lot. And a lot of the issues are somehow propelled by our class and power in American society. So I thought maybe if you could or would comment on that. Tina?
I think one aspect that really clearly comes out working with older people, again, we're looking at a group that's later in their life who used to be young people and you follow their life trajectory forward. And this idea of intersectionality and new theories that are coming up that we all, and actually comes from Black feminist theory, have multiple social locations. In some areas we have access to privilege, in other areas we don't, depending on your given social locations or identities or point in time. So that's an important aspect that and you have to go beyond binary categories. You really need to look at the multidimensionality of each individual. And so that, I think, is critically important. But at the same time, recognize when it's to advantage, if you're dealing with older people and you're able to get them into aging services, that's important, but you need to distinguish between that older person. So sometimes with some of the people that I work with, where we're doing a reintegration study where we're actually funneling them directly into services. Are they HIV positive? Are they older? Are they LGBT? Or are they living in poverty? What are they? Are they one or the other, because we binary, or are they all of the above? And so there's nuances between them. If you don't distinguish that, that's an issue. Where we find some people are telling us if they're a gay man and they're put into housing with a heterosexual man, that when they're released from prison, that might cause problems and friction. So we need to think about the nuances beyond this binary way of looking. You're old, you're not. The other thing is not all old people are frail. There's many that are coming out highly productive that are mentors to others, and including what service providers are saying is giving the opportunity to be mentors. So there could be peer-on-peer support, but it's an intergenerational mentoring, because that's what was missing from a lot of the youths that I worked with, is that the role of an older person. Many thought they were not going to get old, and I don't want to see young people getting to that point where they're not connected with the older generation.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I think that a lot of this stuff comes down to socioeconomic differences. And it just so happens that socioeconomic and race issues overlap. So I think it's a really important lesson for all of us in this room to not become a bit self-satisfied just because we're having certain kinds of conversations that sound really progressive. We have to remember that there is a certain amount of privilege, there's a lot of privilege that attaches to our position socially, and that needs to be leveraged. We can't forget about that kind of stuff. And that happens all too often in the academy. We take our ideas and our categories very seriously. That's what gets people tenure. If you can come up with a new buzzword, then you're set for life. And so that's something really important to realize. We have to realize that on the left, you can become totally obsolescent just because you want to go into a realm of discourse instead of a realm of action. And so I think that that's really important for all of us in this room to remember, because that's a bigger danger than being afraid of becoming joining the NRA or something like that. There's dangers on this side too. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think there's another.
Could you identify yourself for the camera?
Onaji Benjamin, one of the only two correctional people in the room. I think there is another thing what Pedro was saying about class, the intersection of class and race, that we can maybe take an opportunity of. It gets up what the chaplain said. And for example, I call it the so-called heroin epidemic. Because as far as I'm concerned, drugs have been in white middle-class America all along. What's happened is their economic plateau has shifted, and they're coming into my system now. And they're tragically dying, but this happens every 20, 30 years as the pendulum swings. The other thing someone mentioned before, statistically, at least in New York State, about the 5 zip codes, that's shifting. About 51% of the people coming into prison in New York State are now coming from Westchester County, Rockland County up. But that also has to do with economic and class, because it has to do with gentrification and the outsourcing and the brokering of Section 8 housing vouchers out of the city to force people out.
That's a great point. Yeah, Ernie, you had a...
Couple of things, but the first one has to do with PTSD in vets. I work as an investigator on a research project on PTSD in veterans, and I've worked during the Vietnam War with and for veterans on those same issues, and they've come back again, and it was true in Vietnam, and it's true now, is there's an inordinately high rate of arrest and incarceration of veterans. So there's an overlap in these two populations already. Right. I was wondering if you have any experience with that, because there seem to be so many similarities in the circumstances of a lot of the prisoners and a lot of the veterans. For example, one of our studies looks at drug use and trauma in the life of veterans before they went to the war and got PTSD. Right. And you see that there's a predictor there, yes. Including suicide attempts and drug overdoses and and imprisonment, and
Right.
jail and some of it. They used to preclude you from military service. It doesn't anymore.
Right.
So I was wondering if that's come up in your work at all, because you know, it seems shocking on the face of it to suggest that to be anything in common between these heroes, no matter what their circumstance, the veterans, and these demonized individuals who are in prison. But if you look at the profiles, you look at the people, you look at what they have to contend with, you look at the domestic violence rate, the homicide rate, the suicide rate, they're remarkably similar. But there's enormous prejudice against bringing these two worlds together, but I think it's worth the trouble.
Well, unfortunately, I think the veterans will become more demonized, and they are already feeling it themselves. One of the other reasons why. Yeah. When you tell somebody that you're a veteran these days, people automatically assume they have PTSD, and you're going to go crazy on me? Okay, so that's the kind of stigma they're still dealing with now. You know, the PTSD issue, it's a significant problem. Maybe the veterans who are finding themselves on the campuses are in a little better shape than the folks that are dealing with the more severe PTSD. Yeah, right. But I am finding on some campuses there is a real strong cohort of veterans who are suffering, and they really help each other. And they're there for each other, so that helps.
Peer affinity groups.
So
Yes.
That's one of the reimagining or new structures of reintegration.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of them that could apply to prisoners as well as it applies to veterans.
Tina?
The issue is somehow stripping away the self-imposed stigma. I mean, the culture imposes it, but it's incented by the prisoners. And that's in terms of communities where the only people that they know and can hang out with are other prisoners, and often they have prohibitions against associating with other felons.
Right.
But that's the only people they know.
Right.
If you imagine that some of that was stripped away from the burden that they bear as they get out of prison and go back to the community, think about new structures of reintegration. Again, there are parallels there to the people who have been in the war. Once a warrior, always a warrior. You know that book by the doctor, but the idea that finding a group of comrades that are your peers and you can trust them and you share the same horrific experience is a strength in that.
Right, and then move
As
out.
much for prisoners as it does for
Right, but the idea is not to ghettoize. The other side of it is you're ghettoizing. Maybe you're ghettoizing. I don't know if that's a PC word to use, but okay. My people were ghettoized too. You know, we want to have them to build from that strength and then move out into the community. And I was told at a very prominent institution in the city, an Ivy League school, that we don't give spaces to affinity groups. You know, we don't offer spaces or locations or a particular place on campus to affinity groups. And I'm thinking veterans are an affinity group, well, to some extent, but they really are a special population, and they need to be attended to in a different way.
So, Ernie, I also hear you, I just want to be a nerd for a second. I hear you raising another issue, which is the relationship between, in California particularly, split sentencing with conditions of release are becoming the popular modality. And those conditions of release mitigate against the formation of peer affinity groups, because one of those conditions usually is that you can't hang out with other folks who have a felony conviction. And so I think, again, if we're going to be imagining, part of the decarceration movement is likely to involve more and more split sentencing, and more split sentencing is going to come with more and more conditions of release. And so I think part of what we've been looking at is how do we help probation and parole folks frame appropriate conditions of release. And I think that, again, part of having a very broad brush is we've had these sort of absolute conditions of release, and those may not be rational, going back to the success on peer counseling that we're seeing from Transition Clinic from prisoner at the Pima County Jail. But I do think I wouldn't want to let your comment go without raising that split sentencing is one of our tools in terms of decarceration. Tina, I think you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to also mention too, I think this idea of the transition and parallels between both groups, and thinking about the nuances, it's not necessarily that they're veterans or not, or incarcerated or formerly incarcerated or not. We know that there's many justice-involved veterans, including among the older people. And that's a group right now that would be veterans, but currently in prison and are getting out. So that's a particular nuance. And then we take age into account. We need to think about, is it affinity groups and or is it some kind of intergenerational relationships too? So it might be peer on peer, but there's also strengths to this idea of intergenerational programming, but definitely informal supports are important. And family supports too. Also comes out a lot in the data from people in prison that with or without veteran status, but also from the service providers. That was the thing most commonly talked about, was the family support. So peer supports is important, but so is a family. And the other thing is the idea of care. It's what is it about the peers? And I think it's that there's an empathy that somebody understands, and that's what they're really finding has a lot to do with reducing recidivism. And one other quick comment with the narratives that I'm sorry? But family support, just having that support, that social support is commonly there. And one thing about the narratives among older people, those that got out of prison, out of Vietnam, also the stigma associated with Vietnam was very traumatizing to them. And if they had a history of sexual abuse, of which many people reported, and they happened to be drinking alcohol or had some kind of significant life event, that's the thing that triggered them into committing a crime. And so there's a prevention argument too, to making sure that people who come home from the war get, if they have trauma, get the kind of treatment, because it could put them at risk of getting involved in the justice system. And we can stop it, and that's the whole thing about prevention. Many people who, particularly later in life, get involved post-war, we could stop that if we get them the right treatment.
Kara?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kara Tabachnik. I'm with the Center of Media Crime and Justice here at John Jay. I wanted to talk to you or have you comment a little bit on the BJS report that was just released this week, which is the first major federal study looking at recidivism and rearrest rates over the past 2 decades. And the findings, troublingly enough, are the same as they were 2 decades again. 2/3 of all people released from prison are rearrested within 3 years, and 1/3 of all people released from prison are rearrested in 6 months. Can you comment on that report and how that correlates with the work in your field, and if you think some of, I guess, some points and maybe some changes we can make?
I've been on the road all week, so I haven't read the report, but it doesn't surprise me. I mean, this is when we're treating justice-involved individuals as though there's just like a one-size-fits-all means of being able to solve this problem without looking at the legitimate destabilized community structures that have been created through years and years of marginalization. I don't see a way that we can fix this problem without treating these major, deep causes of criminogenic behavior. And so to me, this doesn't surprise me, because we haven't had a major cultural shift. We're still children of Reagan. So I don't know how that's going to be shifting. I'm hoping the ACA, I think, is going to be, what's that? Only, yeah, sorry. Oh, yeah, yeah. We've had him as governor and as president, so we love him. So it doesn't surprise me, I'm sorry to say. I think the ACA is going to be a huge change for this, because the ACA now, it's expanded the Medicaid population, and for me, this was really surprising. I didn't realize that if you were a single poor male individual without dependent children, you weren't eligible for Medicaid. It didn't matter how poor you were. But now, because of the expansion of Medicaid, states that have expanded their Medicaid program now will be able to cover people individuals who make 138% of the poverty line. And so this is a huge change. And part of the new Medicaid coverage is mental health parity, behavioral health parity. So now there's substance use treatment programs, mental health treatment programs that people can go to, all paid for with federal dollars, 100%. And these types of programs, I think, are going to be a huge shift, because who do we see going through the jail time and time again? It's these poor individuals with substance use disorders who come in, they sober up, they get tossed back out on the street, and then they come in a few days later.
So that's my political economy echo of Bernie's point this earlier today.
Actually, this fits perfectly.
Could you
with your
identify
question.
yourself, please?
My name is Jed Tucker. I'm the Director of Reentry for the Bard College Prison Initiative. We're a private college that's been running inside 6 New York State prisons for about a decade. I started as an instructor in the program, and 2 years ago I became the Director of Reentry. I know a number of the people in the room, and thank you all very much for putting this on. Also, I should say about where we are with the prison initiative, 2 years ago we also started offering public health courses to our graduates. Just about everybody who takes those courses has already gotten an undergraduate degree with us. They're still in prison, they still have more time. And we started seeing that for people getting out, the world of the social service, human services was open to hiring people with a record. And they were finding lots of work pretty quickly. And we thought, well, if they get some training in public health, maybe we could kind of raise the glass ceiling of where they might get. That's why we got into public health. I wanted quickly, and so I have a question, my question that I had 10 minutes ago when Ernie brought up this very interesting question that's been going on for a little while, was to tie in something from an earlier talk to this one. And then your question, I have a very different answer than you to the question about why the same recidivism rates. I think very simply, and it ties into my other comment, very simply, prisons produce recidivism. They always will. The numbers, the thing that we never know about the BJS reports, and they have, as you say, they've been, now I didn't know this one just came out, but the previous 2 had the same numbers, same rates. They don't break down who actually is recidivating or not. So, and I don't mean by crime. We get the crime statistics, how many people convicted of murder recidivate versus something else. But I'm talking about how many people were in for a short period of time, long period of time. How old were they? Which communities they're recidivating in or not. So these and you see state by state, it's very different. And you see, like, in fact, as we know in New York, that has had this dramatic success in decarceration. It can be done very differently. It can be tweaked, is all I want to say. And that's not a full answer, so let me get on to my next point. My concern about public health. I love public health. I'm an advocate of public health. I'm training, hoping and bringing in more teachers to train our students in public health. And the reason for that, and the reason why my colleagues and I got into public health and got excited about it, was we thought it really, as a discourse, as a theory, as a field, it offered a real alternative to criminology. Sorry to all the criminologists in the room, but all of and in particular, and this resonated with our experience in the college, which one of the shocking things I'll say about the college has been, we take people who have little to no educational history. We've been accused in our program, we're a selective program, you have to apply to get in. We've been accused of creaming off the top. We've run the number, we've done the statistical analysis of our students. They are on par, average, if not worse educational histories than the general population. And they do very well. Our students get bachelor's degrees from Bard and go on to graduate school, including some of them coming to this school, other schools in the city. So initially when this has been happening, and frankly, the truth of the matter is the history of education in higher education and prisons has shown this over and over again. We're obviously not the first program to do this. We're just the one doing it in this kind of moment where we've lost federal funding. So what that said to me early on was all the statistics about who's in prison. The drug in New York, I think 74% of people have addiction problems. Mental illness problems, we hear about it all the time. We heard about it a lot today. I started saying, well, maybe our students aren't those students, since they seem to be doing very well in a very rigorous program. This is an intense college program. And I started talking to our students, and in fact, 95% of them are considered to have addiction problems. And I talked to them, well, are you an addict? You know, I started having these kind of conversations with people over time. And it turns out in the Department of Corrections in New York, you get labeled an addict, if you answer yes to the question, have you ever had a drink? Now, I'll get the pew later. Give me a break. Hold on. If you want to talk about the pew, all right. So you can be labeled an addict. You can be labeled that. You can have a mental health problem by answering some silly questions that they ask in the Department of Corrections. I have come to the point where and this ties into your panel, which I think is really important, and how to kind of imagining other structures of reintegration. I start with reimagining who's in prison. All we hear about from BJS, criminologists, sociologists forever, people in my field, I'm an anthropologist, is all the deficits of people who are in prison.
Right.
They come from these neighborhoods, they have these problems, everything, and then the solutions we have are all to deal with those particular problems. Come out, stick them in another anger program, stick them in another drug program, and so forth. And then what? And then what? So what if we get them off of everything, but they need a job, they need a place to live, the real stuff. That, in fact, we feel education is the best kind of intervention for dealing with. So, sorry, going on too long. My concern about public health, and I want to ask Ernie and the other epidemiologists in the room is, my worry is that you will merely reproduce the statistics of criminology rather than introduce, I know from what I've read about public health, I've started to learn about it, you have some very interesting other ways of characterizing populations that if we started using those on the prison population might show opportunity, might show talent and so forth, where so far all we see is deficit. Anybody who knows people in prison or has experience in prison, you know there's lots of talent, lots of capable people in there. You all know you're working directly with them. And other populations too that are stigmatized in various ways. When you work with them, you see they can do things. And I hope that public health as an intervention will start to create a discourse about at a population level. So it's not just me and my little 300 student. Everybody says, well, you're only dealing with a small number of people. Whatever. This is a window onto what's really going on inside. And you all will take the population statistics at a large scale and be able to say, indeed, what's going on here is representative because yes, he's labeled as an addict, but he's also X, Y, and he also has this other talent. So I want to just put that out there while on the one hand, I'm a whole hog with public health. Bring it into the prisons, write books like Ernie's about the prison to make us rethink what this population is about. But also I'm worried that we're just going to reproduce the deficit model of who's inside.
So Ernie, before I let them get your mic to you so you can answer that, and I will give you the answer from our perspective. From our perspective, part of what we're trying to figure out, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of the triple aim in healthcare, but part of what we're trying to figure out is how does the triple aim, which is sort of the general rhetoric for health reform, population health, community health, cost of health, how does this fit within the correctional population? And what does this mean in terms of that? Population, go ahead. Right. Yeah, but I'm just so, it's population health, community health, cost of health is what the triple aim is, okay? And so I think the question that we've been trying to look at COCHS is how do we take this triple aim, which the IHI, which started, Don Berwick, that started this conversation, is the first to admit they never thought about the correctional population in terms of that. That how do we try to take these concepts and reframe them? And I agree with you that within the framework of population health is the opportunity to look at different variables than we have traditionally looked at in the overall population, whether that's education or anything else. So along those lines, for example, part of what we at COCHS have been really concerned about is Common Core and what Common Core will mean for folks who are trying to pass the GED. That one of the we know is the high correlates of success in decarceration. The two major predictors are education and health insurance. Believe it or not, that's what the research tells us the two major predictors are. Well, we believe the Common Core may be a significant barrier to folks in a correctional setting who are trying to pass the GED. It's something that we've been trying to think about and talk about, but I appreciate your comment. And Ernie, I'm going to pass the ball to you. So population is for the population as a whole, community health is for a specific community. right, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Let's go back to Jed's question about the methods of epidemiology compared to those of criminology. They're really, there's no systematic difference in them. They're the same as methods of sociology or social psychology, anything that looks at aggregate data on populations. I think what's different is the questions. And my experience with criminologists is that their accountabilities have a lot more to do with criminal justice outcomes than, let's say, mental health outcomes, which are inherently, how's the person doing? You know, are they surviving? Are they committing suicide? Are they going back into depression or drug use, whatever it might be? They're ego questions, whereas the questions, and this is one of the problems with for example, alternatives to incarceration, which are administered by a criminal justice system that is only thinking about recidivism and return to crime rather than the actual outcomes from a mental health point of view of there's little faith that providing mental health is going to reduce recidivism. No one's ever bothered to try to test that proposition because you can see in the mental health not just mental health programs, that I think Tina could say something about this around forensic clinical services, that
Sure.
the accountabilities tend to be to whoever's paying the bill. So 75% of publicly funded drug treatment in New York State now is under mandates. It's very difficult to voluntarily get into a drug treatment program here in New York State, a public drug treatment program. They're all taken up by mandated slots. So of course the programs, in fact, with one of the graduates of the BARD program, who's in the doctoral program at NYU Sociology now, we just got acceptance of a paper in Health and Justice on this matter of the matching of mandated drug treatment cases in New York State to what the people in the court system say about what they're doing and what the managers of the drug programs and the staff of the drug programs know about what the courts expect and what they want, because he who pays the piper calls the tune. And they care little about people leaving. They don't see it as failure because they get another person to fill that bed the next day, and that's their business model. I'm kind of cynical about it, but our paper will be out in this journal soon. We'll see.
Yeah.
But there's actually, is Annabelle here still? Oh, okay, because we have 3 graduates from this program who've worked in our programs at John Jay. Anyway, I don't think it's in the methodological issue. I think it's the intent of characterizing populations fully and accurately and in detail that discriminates between the things that determine the outcomes that are in the population as opposed to some performance result you're looking for relative to commission of crime.
You've been very patient.
Okay.
I'm good.
I can make a brief comment in response to recidivism rates and then about looking at the strengths of the populations. According to, I'll give some examples from the older people, the reentry study that I'm working on, which I actually begin to call it reunification as opposed to reintegration. But the one man in particular, he was in prison over 40 times. And so I said, what was it that made a difference this time that you did not return? And he said that he had gotten training while in prison. He learned to be a peer forensic specialist. He also was eligible because there was a new program that started to prepare him prior to getting out. He had a mental health issue, and he was connected to services directly when he got out. He got housing, and he said, if I didn't have that, I would have committed another crime to go back in. So having additional supports, in addition to peers, family specialists, housing, like having that foundation when you come out and preparing ahead of time. And in terms of I worked in the criminal justice system, as you know, but as a social worker, we often will use the strengths perspective and look at resilience, and this might be similar with psychology. So this is the interesting thing when all professions start to join forces, we begin to see different lenses in how we look at things, and we co-construct together. We can really solve the problems because we haven't done a good job altogether to get rid of this problem once and for all. But I'd be happy to talk to you more about how it's not just a social work perspective, but we use it and it draws from other disciplines, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I hope this public health approach is very self-reflective. I just want to piggyback what you were talking about. I work in the Dutchess County Jail. We have 180 inmates at this time housed in other jails. We're overcrowded. We're spending $6 to $8 million a year for the last 5 years, and now we're getting ready to build a $200 million jail. So there is a hydraulic sense, because I think after post-Rockefeller, there's a push down, and they're starting to show up in the jails. My personal anecdotal thing about that is it's connected to a failed, illusionary, mythological drug treatment model. All right? So the men in my jail are sitting there waiting to go to treatment. It takes 4 months to get a forensic, then they're sent to Happy Hill someplace up in the mountain somewhere, all right, to a 12-step model, or a model that doesn't work. 8% success rate.
Yeah.
If General Motors, maybe not a good analogy, if General Motors, all right, if 92 of their cars coming off the line, the brakes didn't work, they wouldn't tell the driver to pump harder. Okay, but we have a model out there that failed. So 2 things happen. We send people to a system, and the ones who do try to believe in it are getting placebo for whatever.
No, worse than placebos. Worse than placebos.
Worse than that, and they come out.
Right.
So not only is what I think Travis called a reentry cycle, not only that, but it's killing people. They're dying.
Right.
And the only reason it's getting some visibility now is because the zip codes have shifted. It's still a tragedy. The last 4 funerals I went to were white middle-class kids from Red Hook, Rhinebeck, and Wappingers Falls. All right? But I got one of my guys got killed the other night, stabbed to death. He's black in the city, but that's not on the register. Right. So this health model needs to look at alternative models.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody screams evidence-based. One more point, evidence-based. The statistics from the old Pell Grant, my other master's is on the educational model, right? There's about, what is the lowest recidivism rate correlated to education,
Right.
Right? But now, when I signed up to go to Fordham, I'm graduating in May, I had to check that freaking box that said, have you ever had a felony conviction? Thank God, CUNY, to their credit, doesn't deal with that. But every SUNY system in this state, and they all have different policies, are blocking and keeping people from going into the very intervention that shows the lowest recidivism rate. So something's wrong with that.
I couldn't agree more, and I want to go back to that it's not a placebo, it's detrimental. We know folks flunk out and that they just end up back in trouble. And I want to go back to what I said in my introductory remarks about entitlement means empowerment. And so the distinction is right now, someone else is making the decision for you that you're going into a 12-step program, okay? Once you have a Medicaid card and you have that entitlement that comes with it, if you don't think that's the right treatment for you, you have a right to a treatment that works for you. Okay.
But you gotta have the therapist out there.
That's correct. I'm not going to go into the community supply issue. That's a separate question. Okay, it's a separate question because it's going to take us a couple of years to dial up that community supply. But part of what I'm just talking about is that there's a structural shift within the Affordable Care Act itself, which is rather than having the correctional system be the decider, that entitlement means empowerment and that you get to be the decider of what kind of treatment you think works for you. And that's a significant shift from how we've thought about it up until now.
But what's the condition of your parole and probation? What do you do?
Well, then I think what happens is you go back to your probation, your parole officer, and you say, and I think we're starting to see this in California because of realignment and how probation officers are remanaging their cases, you go back and basically say, I would rather find a cognitive behavioral therapist that I think works better for me. Is that okay with you? And traditionally, because again, we're having this shift in California on the role of POs and the emphasis on what they're very strictly meaning by evidence-based in terms of probation and recidivism, because all the jails have consent decrees, et cetera, and so forth, they don't want to pull them back, okay? So I think that's part of the structure. I just have a question for you. Of your folks, how many are pretrial? Do you know what percentage of pretrial in the Dutchess County Jail?
A significant amount.
Probably 2/3? Yeah, and that's, I just want to focus on that for a minute, that's the craziness of how we're running the railroad, and most of those folks are going to get sentenced to time served, okay? And the county is spending how many millions of dollars, right? Right, okay, I just want to lay it out. Going back to political economy and Bernie's question, we believe that the Affordable Care Act is going to shift that dial because it's crazy for the county to keep doing that when they can release those folks on their own recognizance and subject to participating in treatment.
85%
Right, okay, so we're saying the same thing. So again, part of where we see a paradigm shift is there's a political economy in this. If I'm holding them pretrial and I'm Dutchess County, I'm paying for it. If I release them on their own with cognizance, subject to participating in treatment, the feds pay for it. Those are going to be economic pressures that go back to Bernie's keynote conversation. There's a question back there. Someone has a microphone.
Yes.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Tanaja Jordan, and I'm the Queen's Justice Corps Director at the Center for Alternative Sentencing and Employment Services. Mouthful. Just a quick 2 questions, actually. The first one is, how are people actually defining recidivism? Are we talking about arrests on new charges? Are we talking about technical violations? Are we talking about extensions of convictions or new convictions? And then also, I think this information has been really, really wonderful. You know, we're a program that works to leverage people's assessed strengths to mitigate, risk factors. But at the end of the day, a lot of our clients are over-policed and very aggressively policed because they were incarcerated, and sort of there's also practically people are being policed by proxy. Every time you have to pay a fee to go to report, anytime you have providers that can tell you where you can and can't live, that you even if you had a dime baggie of weed for 2 seconds, you've got to do 6 months of drug treatment that you really don't need. The deliberate construction of a negative relationship with services so that you fall out of services and wind up back in jail on a violation in the first place. So my second question is there an effective way to have these kind of conversations specifically about policing methods?
So I can't answer the first because I didn't see the BJS study because we've been on the road all week. Do you know, Kara, do you know the answer? Huh? It's rearrest. Okay, that's new charges or old, do you know? We don't know. Okay, you'll have to look at the study. I apologize, but I've been on the road and haven't gotten to see it. On the second one, I think we heard Jeremy talking this morning about part of the work that's going on here with Susan in terms of trying to rethink this whole relationship on policing. I think New York City has a new police commissioner. I think that the charge of that new police commissioner is pretty clear. I think the question will be, does the top-down policies have anything to do with what actually plays out on the street? And I think it's going to take us a while to figure that out. Who has the next question? Could you identify yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Dr. Samuels. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the veterans very quickly. In Occupy, we have a good-sized number of veterans. And one of the things that concerns me is I see a high level of PTSD and homeless veterans. I mean, it's just unbelievable how you have people who stood on the wall for us in this country are in the streets and can't get housing or proper treatment. My mind is still blown, and I'm sorry I missed the presentation by the gentleman from Corrections earlier today, because I sure would have asked him, how in the world do you have a homeless vet? And it seemed like it was a silly thing that he was put in jail for. Not that serious. Cooked to death in a cell. Cooked to death. How does this happen? So, to me, when I'm looking at it from a medical perspective, and I've been involved with jailhouse medicine, and I think it's despicable how inmates are treated. Because most of them are in there for drug-related offenses, is not murder and all this other kind of stuff. But even then, it's not proper to treat them that way. But when it comes to veterans, it just really, really bothers me what's going on. And we really got to make a reassessment of how we're treating them and how we're dealing with them. Homelessness, all this other stuff is causing all these other things to happen to them. And it's just very, very sad.
There are some buildings that have gone up in New York, in particular in the Bronx, by organizations like the Jericho Project, and they have specific housing for veterans, and they're all different kinds of labels, transitional kinds of housing and temporary housing, whatever the terms are. There aren't enough, and that's a problem. The VA is trying to address the issue of homelessness and has set up all different kinds of programs, and we have a facility up on 125th Street at 55 West 125th, and another one in Brooklyn, just focused on that issue of homelessness and just, trying to work with it. The PTSD issue and the trauma, I was thinking about that kind of pre-morbid trauma that somebody might go into the service with and then end up at much higher risk when they are finished with their service, and even when they're in basic training. So we're looking at suicide rates of people who haven't even gone into combat. So before I was coordinator of the Vital Initiative, I was a suicide prevention coordinator. So the VA was also trying to address, we're trying to do this, and we're trying to do the research, and maybe not enough, and not enough manpower is put into these very important issues. But we are trying to address them.
And once again, I think it's really important to point out the parallels between the incarcerated population and those who are veterans. Our veterans are drawn from a particular socioeconomic class, just like our prisoners are. Mm-hmm. They need services. There aren't enough services available to these individuals, and because of that, these people get congregated together in the jail. The jails become our de facto mental health institutions, and this is a huge problem. And that's why I think that the ACA does provide a lot of hope, because for once now it's going to pull together all of these individuals, give them a means of connecting to these services. The federal government will be the ones who will be footing the bill for this. And I think that, and my hope is that this will make sure that services follow where this money is going to go. This is, once again, paying attention to the market forces to realize that that there are market things happening. There's capital now. There's money in this area, and we need to make sure that the services are there. So that's why they end up in the jail. There haven't been the services there before, and nobody's going to be able to make money off of that. Our community providers aren't large enough for this. They don't have the capital to raise to create a big enough institution for this. And so I think the ACA is going to be a huge game changer.
Who has the mic now? I think we have time for 2 more questions.
This is a quick comment on public health, and I want to add some color to what public health professionals do, and it's an urbanist perspective. If you think about one of the fathers of public health, the epidemiology side of public health, John Snow, who found the source of the cholera epidemic was this well who was in this neighborhood where there was a cluster of cases. And this is a reference back to what Pedro was saying this morning about we know where the concentration of people that are getting in trouble are living, right? So if John Snow had said, let me teach y'all how to boil the water so that you can have clean water instead of taking the damn pump hand off and think about building a clean well. Like, we are forgetting that this is not just about how do we take one by one each one of the guys or girls that are coming out of prison and how do we take care of them at a scale level. That's not necessarily the only way to think about population level approaches to this problem. You need to think about the places, the neighborhoods, the social context in which this is happening, and let's build a clean well. Let's think about how we flip this paradigm of the $1 million blocks, and instead of having millions of dollars spent keeping folks incarcerated, how do we think about that, reinvesting those millions of dollars in those same neighborhoods to do economic development, to nurture the incredible entrepreneurial acumen that many of the young people that are getting in trouble in the drug market have. They're obviously very smart in terms of many skills that they have. They're just applying them for one particular category. There might be other skills that they have that can be reshifted. So I want us to think about the public health perspective of the urbanist perspective to public health. Is thinking about let's go back to those neighborhoods and let's think about how do we rebuild those neighborhoods.
So I just want to tell a story about that, and I'm going to show my age. So back when the OEO, Neighborhood Health Center program, was started, one of the startups was in Mississippi, and there was a third-generation African-American pediatrician named Dr. Aaron Shirley, who's still alive, who was seeing a bunch of young folks, children who were showing up with diarrhea, all of whom happened to live in the same community. And rather than shutting off the well, he used his OEO grant funds to buy water trucks to go out and deliver water to those communities to stop the diarrhea epidemic. And I think it's just a wonderful example of sort of the counter John Snow argument of how instead do we figure out how to create community development and how do we do that. And it's a wonderful anecdote. We have time for one more question. Who has the microphone? Yeah.
He did over there. He isn't going.
I do.
Right, Jack Geiger was the one. Jack was the one who was the one who approved Aaron going out and using that money. That's correct. Yeah, last question.
Hi, I'm Mike Fagan. I want to go back to the drug treatment and why we're so quick to prescribe it as opposed to offering education. And I don't think we've spent enough time on the method of payment that comes in there, in that you are paid individually to provide drug treatment and then you bill Medicaid for it. And that is often a much richer funding stream than when you offer education. Another part that I think factors into it, and we were asked to talk about race frankly earlier, is that you know, we don't want, and we in the collective, not me, hopefully, we don't want you near our daughters. And so if we offer you education at SUNY, we don't want that to happen. There's too much mixing, if you will. There's too much risk. Okay, and I would work on that, you know. Okay, keep it a little real here. Okay, sorry. It's the end of the day. You can, right? A little on, okay. Whereas that level of mixing, and I'll work on that word as the day goes on maybe, isn't present with drug treatment. With drug treatment, they're assumed to be all pretty similar. They're not going to be near our daughters. They're assumed to all be felons, and they're not assumed to be affecting the funders, the people who are close to the funders.
That's a really good point. Okay, I think it's time. Do you want to make a comment, Dan? Before
I just wanted to jump one more on that. This goes back to that thing that
Everybody listen.
we don't have time. Go ahead, Dan.
This goes back to what I mentioned at the very beginning. When we have this idea that governance is different from the community and community participation, we need to stop living with that kind of paradigm. That governance is us on the outside who are then helping these communities figure themselves out. We need to understand that there is agency in those communities and that sometimes we have to get out of the way. So this is, I think, one of the major barriers is realizing that this governance structure means giving up a bit of that power. And that's not going to happen very easily.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. Thank panel. I think, Jeff, we have a break coming up next. Is that correct? Right?